Alrighty, hello and welcome to the celebration of manga 2025, courtesy of EveryLibrary. My name is John Shableski. I'm your host for this event. I've been in the library publishing market for about 20 years now, and it's been fascinating to watch the evolution of this category. And by the way, now I am running the oldest independent bookstore in the country, the Auto Bookstore here in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And so several of the people that you're going to meet during this panel are folks that we've all run into or have encountered or worked with over the past couple decades. And I would like to start with Mr. Tucker Stone.
Hi, I'm Tucker Stone. I'm the Executive Director of Communications and Marketing for Fantagraphics, the publisher of the world's greatest cartoonist. And in that same category of world's greatest cartoonist are some incredible manga artists that I'm happy to be here to talk to you about today.
All righty, next up, Mark.
Hello, how's it going, everybody? I'm Mark, Sales and Marketing Director at Yen Press. I've served Yen Press in this role for about 5 years, but I've worked in manga for much longer than that. I worked at another company, one that you'll hear about today, for about 9 years. So it can be said that I've worked in manga my entire adult life, my entire professional life. It's something that I love, and I loved it before I began working in it professionally. So I'm happy to talk about it with you all today.
Thank you, sir. TJ.
Hi, thanks for having us all here today, John. My name is TJ Ferrantini, pronouns they, them, he, him, and I'm a senior editor with Penguin Random House Publisher Services working on Kodansha comic books. So I started off in the industry 8 years ago as an editorial intern. After that, I worked as a publishing associate for Kodansha US for a bit. And then after that, I moved over into editorial. And for those of y'all who don't know Kodansha, we're the publisher of manga series such as Attack on Titan, Akira, Sailor Moon. And now we're also publishing a lot of really fun BL, Yuri, and LGBTQ plus manga, a lot of which that I've had the pleasure of editing. So looking forward to chatting about a lot of great books with you guys today. Thanks.
Very cool. Congratulations. All right, Mike, you're next.
Hi, I'm Mike Montesa. I work for Viz Media, where I'm a senior editor. I've been working at Viz for close to 18 years now. And before that, I lived and worked in Japan for almost as long. But my association with manga and all things Japanese really goes back a long, long way to when I was a little kid. And I suppose I might talk about that more later on. But yeah, now I'm working on a lot of books that you might have heard of: Demon Slayer, My Hero Academia, and a lot of others. So yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Right. My first question, each one of you are going to have a shot at answering these, and also for follow-up as well. And Tucker, you and I are the old guys of the bunch, but you've worked for several different houses. So I think your perspective on this, and then everybody else will answer, is why is manga so compelling?
Well, yeah, I'm kind of excited to answer that question because I wonder if I come at it from a different place. I've spent a lot of time working with different manga publishers like Dinpa, which is run by Ed Chavez, who used to be at Vertical. I worked in retail and sold things like Akira and obviously everything that Viz has ever put out ever, But one thing that really, there's things about format that are obviously really pleasing. I think the kind of uniformity of a lot of we know what we're going to get when it comes to manga in terms of a consumer relationship. But one thing that struck me with the work that I've done with the International Board for Books for Young People has been that 99% of the time, if a child in this country, in the United States, is reading works in translation, they're reading manga. That's what they're reading. That's the first book that they read that comes from another country. And as somebody who now, not to be the most cliched person in the world, but I have a child. I have an 11-year-old daughter. And what strikes me so much is that so much of the culture that's kind of being sold to her from American publishers is often things that they were still the same things that were being sold to me when I was born 40 years ago. And if I had been a kid and you had been telling me I needed to watch movies from 1938 or sequels to things that were from 1942 to understand my culture, I would have been no, where's my thing? And when I look at, when I think of the kids who used to come through my store in Brooklyn, when I think of the kids who are like just voracious readers at libraries, and because I worked with Ingram, which sells primarily into libraries, manga creates a culture that can be theirs. It's not their parents. It's not their big brother's adult stories that they have to now buy into. They don't have to spend 20 years of research and stuff like that. They have their own thing. It's theirs. And the scope of what's available to them is so vast, as opposed to, as somebody who comes a lot from American comics too, where we're just limited to some degree by like, here's some superhero stuff and here's some zombie stuff. And if you don't like that, then sometimes there's superheroes that are also zombies. Whereas like with manga, it's like the tapestry is wide open again. And if you want to read something as a grown-up, they have grown-up manga. You don't just have to stick to the same things. So when I think about what makes it compelling is that it responds to the people who want to read it. It's open and big enough so that it can just cover that wide tapestry that is reading. It's not just a thing that they have to like touch upon and then move past. It's a thing that they can live with and grow with, and it's always theirs. I don't know. I'm infatuated by the enthusiasm that manga readers have for it. And I find myself at this point, it's like I'm realizing like, oh, I've actually been reading manga now for 25 years, and I still think of myself as like a new person to it, because I'm like 25 years. I mean, but I haven't done all the stuff that like Mike has seen. I mean, like living in Japan, what have you seen? When I talk to my 13-year-old nephew, the stuff that he's associating with, and I'm like, well, but I've been in this too. And it's like, oh, because it's reading, and you never master it, right? So,
right. TJ, I'm curious as to your perspective.
Sorry, my little editorial assistant, my little cat just popped up on my desk, so sorry about that. Yeah, kind of piggybacking off of what Tucker said, what I just love so much about manga that you're seeing nowadays, it's not just for one demographic, it's so universal. For example, one of our titles, Boys Run the Riot, it's about a transgender high school student not only coming into himself, into his own as he realizes that he's trans, but also finding his community, finding his allies, finding friends that support him. Another series that we publish is Love the Answer. It's about this young woman who goes to college, and she's always felt like she's different. She's never understood why people are interested in pursuing romantic relationships. And it's about how she comes across the terms asexuality and realizing that, she's asexual and part of the queer community. And, these are stories that, not only are read by people in Japan that they can resonate with, but people all over the world can resonate with. And I just think that there's such a universal quality to manga nowadays. For example, Kodansha is now, we also have several series that we're calling our reader portal titles, and we're publishing them first in English before they're even released in Japan on our website. So now manga artists are not only just thinking about the Japanese like demographic. Like I think it's becoming more and more prevalent that manga is just so universal and beloved by people all over the world. And I think that's what I feel like is just so very special about it.
Well, thank you. Mark, go ahead and give it a shot.
So my reason for feeling that manga is, let me make sure I have the words for it, compelling. I believe that's the word used in the question, is a simple and potentially controversial one. I feel that manga are the greatest comics in the world. I think they're the most accessible and the most brilliant. I think those two, accessibility and brilliance, were very deliberate from manga culture, and it doesn't. And that's something that could have happened for us in the United States. I assume I'm talking to mostly an American audience. But at the time that manga began developing as an industry was a time where the American comic industry was dealing with censorship. So for all of the developments that were happening in manga, for having creators like Osamu Tezuka or Otomo, making brilliant works, competing with each other, wasn't quite the case in America. I can't really speak to other parts of the world. I'm most familiar with comics culture and history in America, but I look at the differences between the two. I want to contextualize that I'm not saying this as somebody who's not a fan of Western graphic novels. I'm a huge fan of Western graphic novels. The time where I became a big fan of manga was also the time where I became a junkie for my local comic shop, Flying Colors in Concord, California. So when I was buying manga, when I was buying Shonen Jump magazines with my lunch money, I was also buying back issues of X-Men. But the experience I had was when I was singing the gospels of these comics that I loved, whether they be manga or superhero comics, I found that people jived more with what they saw in manga, an art style that might have been more accessible, character designs and storylines that might have been more desirable to female readers. I could go down the list of what made manga so big and popular, but rather than give you this long list or talk about what else was going on in the world at the time, let me keep it simple. Manga are the greatest comics in the world, and that comes from their accessibility and their brilliance.
Mike, what do you got?
I think for me, what's compelling about manga is, like everybody else has said, just the wide range of stories that can be told. Pretty much with manga, whatever kind of story you're looking for, whatever kind of topic, you can find it. I mean, you can even find nonfiction done as manga, like history or something like that. I remember looking at several years ago, there was a series of books that were basically biographies of famous people, you know, Mahatma Gandhi or Rosa Parks, or, you know, just you name it, some famous person, some historical figure, and there was like a manga that told the story of their life. I remember when I was in university, in one of my Japanese classes, we looked at manga that was basically about, and this is back in the 80s when the Japanese economy was still during their bubble. It was a manga about the Japanese economy and why it was the way it was. I mean, it wasn't a fictionalized story. It was explaining the processes of the Japanese economy. So you could, you know, whatever your taste in fiction is, or even nonfiction, you can find manga for it. And I've always been a huge fan of fantasy and science fiction. And, you know, when I encountered manga for the first time, it's probably around, well, manga itself, maybe around 1986 or so, but I'd been looking at Japanese animation since the 70s when I was a little kid. And the art style was very unique. It was very different from what I was seeing with American comics and American animation. And manga as a form of sequential art, it was very dynamic. The art and the characters would break out of the panels. The paneling had a lot of motion to it, and it was just a very attractive form of art. And that, coupled with the wide range of stories that you can tell and the depth with which these stories are told and the characters, just makes the whole thing very compelling. You know, you go into any major bookstore these days, and the manga shelves are several rows long. It's pretty clear that it's become a pretty dominant form of entertainment.
All right, I got a quick follow-up, a tag on to this, and then I want you guys to each think about the manga that struck you most deeply immediately the first time you saw it. And the reason why I'm asking this, I was on a panel not too long ago with Deb Aoki. I think several of you know her. And the conversation was about how it devolves to this manga versus capes and tights. And she said, she puts up this slide of all these facial expressions and all the manga characters and the wide range of expressions of joy and anger and rage and all those great things and romance. And it was wonderful. And then she shows a slide of superheroes and it's all grit and grimace. And she says, this is what brings us in. And I went, that was beautiful. Because now I remember Akira, the first time I saw that book. and I didn't realize what had pulled me in. So with that, let me go to you, Mark. The first manga that you remember really that just stuck with you.
The first manga that I fell in love with was one called Ranma One Half, and it actually ties into an experience with a library. My brother borrowed a stack of Ranma One Half volumes, not in sequential order, just random volumes. And I'd known Ranma more as an anime than as a manga at the time. So I bring the story up to sort of tell you the story of my first experience of falling in love with manga, sitting under a blanket and with a lamp and just tearing through it. And if I were to describe the appeal of it, let's start off with that I was 13 or 14 years old at the time that I'm reading this. So I had just entered high school. And it was a time where it was very easy to dream about what the rest of my life would look like and what high school would look like. And Ranma had everything that I would want in my life. At first, I still am a big fan of Chinese martial arts, and Ranma was all about that. But in addition to that, there's a lot of fun in it. It's a very fun manga of silly things going on with Ranma and his rivals, or the kids in the high school, or with his various love interests. And that's the other thing is, as a 13 or 14-year-old, that's when I started becoming interested in romance. That's when crushes would overwhelm my life. And Ranma was a comic that would help me experience that vicariously through the book. And in kind of a realistic and aspirational way. Like, he never gets the girl. But that's kind of what makes it fun. It's always this longing. I could gush about this for hours, but I just want to say that this was the perfect comic for a 13 or 14-year-old Mark to read. And it's really what set off a passion for the rest of my life. So thank you very much, librarian at the Pinole Public Library, who's had this fat stack of Ranma volumes that my brother saw. You changed my life.
Very cool. Tucker, how about you?
I don't think I really realized it was manga at first when I started reading in rural Georgia, and the comics that I would get the things that they were in like an American comic format, and that was Appleseed, and which I thought was amazing because it was just like cyberpunk stuff at the time before I even knew what that meant. Golga 13, which I thought was awesome. I also love the anime, and I just loved Golga 13. I still love anything that is associated with just like stern maniacs. But for me, the thing that made me realize what this art form was and what I was getting from it was different than everything else was Drifting Classroom, which is Kazu Umez or Umez. I'm always bad at, he changed his name, I guess, or whatever. But that blew me away. It blew me. It was like, this is something that's happening here. The way that he develops emotion, the way that he doesn't, the way that he kind of has these characters and the way they interact, their life, the movement, the motion, and the narrative and the entertainment of it. It was different than everything else that I had read in comics at that point, and it broke open manga for me. It gave me something that I was like, I'm not looking for something that is like what I'm reading. I'm looking for something that is unlike it, and that was what it opened it up for me. So.
And Mike.
For me, my first exposure to manga, it's kind of jumbled up and a bit backwards, and it sort of addresses one of your other questions later on. I was watching a show on a local TV channel after school in the late 70s called Star Blazers. And that was a very famous Japanese animation TV show. It's also known as Space Battleship Yamato. That was my first exposure to Japanese animation, and I'll say Japanese storytelling, right? Which was a real far cry from what you got with the standard American, TV animation for kids. Main characters died, and the effects of these deaths were seen on the other characters. People would mourn the loss of their friends. They would, suffer through these struggles and all this sort of thing. And that was when I was probably in elementary school, just starting junior high school. By the time I got to high school, a friend of mine who had lived in Japan with his family, who was in the Navy, showed me the original Space Battleship Yamato in Japanese. No dubs, no subs, just all in Japanese. couldn't understand a word of it, but I loved it. The voice acting and the way that the characters express themselves, still it came through. And since I had already seen the English dub, I kind of knew the story, so I was able to follow it. And that led me to taking a couple Japanese classes in university later on. So my exposure to that kind of storytelling from Japan was already there. And then I'm going through Comics in Berkeley one afternoon, and I find one of Viz Media's first ever publications, which was Area 88. That was probably my first exposure to actual manga. And this was when we were doing these things in the American comic book style. And everything was flipped left to right. And that story blew me away. If you don't know about Area 88, it's basically got a lot of jet fighters and that sort of thing. And I'm a big aviation buff, so I went for that. I really liked that. It was really intriguing. It was compelling. I loved it. My interest in Japan, just like a lot of people these days, it just got deeper and deeper. And eventually I made it in Japanese, and I went to Japan for graduation. And a lot more manga was read after that, I'll tell you.
Sure. Okay, TJ.
Oh yeah, so my manga gateway, so to say, was a Cardcaptor Sakura. And I had grown up seeing the anime on TV, but it was really interesting because the anime was just called Cardcaptors, not Cardcaptor Sakura. And they did some edits to the dub to make it appeal, for lack of a better word, both to a like male and a female audience. So like I think the first episode that aired was also a little bit, they like had skipped a few episodes so that you're introduced to both Shoran, who's the main male character, and then Sakura, who's also the main female character. But one day I was walking in a bookstore, and I've always loved reading. I was always like a very voracious reader, even when I was younger. And then when I saw that the first volume, I'm like, wait, there's a book of this? Like, I've seen the TV show, but there's a book. And that just completely blew my mind, because I got one perceptive of the storyline through the anime, but then I realized that like, no, the main character is this young girl, and it's like, you know, she's just like any other person that you can meet in school. She has her favorite subjects, she has her least favorite subjects, you know, but and then this fantastical thing happens to her, and now she needs to go and search for all these magical cards. You know, you were chatting before about how with like superheroes, you know, they're all in costumes and it's this one thing. And I just found it amazing how like every single time she's going after the monster of the day, she's wearing like a whole new outfit, and like her best friend is there like cheering her on. So that was also like not only my first kind of gateway into manga, but also the whole like magical girl genre, which is just so inspiring and empowering. But again, like as an avid reader, like that just made me really excited that there was this form of media that I was consuming. And I will say, like, I think as I was watching anime, I didn't realize that it was anime at the time. I thought like, oh, it's another cartoon, the characters look like this. But reading Cardcaptor Sakura, that was also when Tokyo Pop was publishing it, and they had like the 100% authentic manga, you know, stamp on it, because it was still being, you know, it was read right to left. So that was kind of my first entryway to like, oh no, like it's not only this one book, there's also tons and millions of like other series that are just like it.
You know, when you talked about that moment of discovery, I saw just the other day, this kid did that look. He reached out on the bookshelf, and it was Rosa Versailles, and he kind of like held it like this golden moment, and he was looking around for somebody to tell that he couldn't believe he saw this. And it was just, that was one of those things that made me even now thrilled to be, you know, a bookseller now, which is really pretty cool. But that moment, I think we all have that, where it was that lightning bolt. Mike, I'm going to start with you on the next one. A question I hear quite often is, does every successful manga series begin as anime? But you came back with a better question.
Yeah, flip that around. It should be, does every successful anime begin with a manga?
Right.
because that's really the progression of things. In Japan, generally the manga will be released out into the wild, and if it becomes successful, then they will develop it as an anime. That's not 100% the case. There are exceptions where some property will be an animation first. I'm thinking specifically of Tiger and Bunny from about 10, 15 years ago. In that case, they made the animation and then they did the manga afterwards. But yeah, I think that perception, at least here in the States, is simply because most people are exposed to these things on TV first, animation
Right.
first, as I was. I mean, I was watching Star Blazers on TV, yeah. So it for other things too, like if you just regular movies, there's usually a novelization that's released as part of the marketing for the film.
Right.
So I think people assume that the animation comes first and then the manga, but it's actually the flip. It's the manga that comes first, and then if that's successful, then they'll do animation.
So, Mark, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, like Mike, I feel this is a question that probably should have been worded differently. There's relatively few manga that are inspired by the anime. The case is usually that anime is based off of manga. Once again, not 100% true, but I'd say more often than not true. And I think the reason why a question like this is asked is because anybody who stocks manga at a library or a store or is a sales jerk like me who has to look at the numbers, it's very clear that there is a relationship between an anime adaptation of a manga and the success the manga has. So I think a more interesting question is, do all manga need an anime to succeed? And the answer is, of course, no. The answer is no. We are now at a time where, we are at a time where more people read anime or watch anime than read manga, right? So, and because of that, you still will see these lifts in manga sales following the release of an anime. But our industry has developed to a point where there are people who just read manga. They're not as much of anime people. They're voracious readers in the same way that people would love superhero comics and not necessarily like the superhero movies. We will see that for manga. And because of that, there's several manga series that see success years before their anime adaptation comes out. Speaking of success years before the anime adaptation, you'll even see some that become mainstream successes. And the fiduciary responsibility in me is kind of cringing at the fact that I'm going to bring up examples from the competition, but they're just such good examples. Uzumaki from Viz was selling gangbusters when, around the time that the anime was announced, but we're talking about close to half a decade before that first episode of the anime, something that premiered fairly recently, came about. A series called Chainsaw Man was breaking records, was having numbers that seemed unreal, to be frank, a good while before the anime came out. So, despite the fact that anime usually does lead to the success of the manga, we are seeing several cases, some very extreme cases in which the manga is performing quite well without the aid of an anime.
Tucker, because you're more veteran, the earliest days of these conversations with when Viz was lighting things up and Tokyo Pop were coming in, it was interesting to see traditional Japanese houses a little bit confused about how the American market would work and how things broke. Do you feel we're more in line now with how, and everybody gets a shot at this one, but I'm curious as to Tucker's perspective on this. Is the American market now more aligned with how traditional Japanese properties are released, exploited, celebrated?
I'm sorry, I'm not totally sure if I know what you're asking.
Well, the earliest days. So how is the approach of marketing manga in the US, how has it evolved from the earliest days?
Well, I would say the big thing that's changed is, I mean, there's like apocryphal stories about the way that like sales reps at places like Penguin Random House, I mean, not to throw them under the bus, but like there's apocryphal stories from like 20 years ago about how they would react when they had to like sell superhero comics, and it was like, this is not the business that I want to be into. It's that I have to sell this collection of the time that Batman punched this guy. I don't know if those apply to manga too, but there is a thing where it's like that body of employment changed. I mean, when those things first started blowing up, it was somewhat of a limited amount of people who could speak about it with any sort of facility. It was sort of a limited amount of, even now, of librarians who could speak about it with any sort of facility, because it's not like a lot of the manga that first started showing up came with like these really great essays grounding it in where it came from, or the nuance of it. It's not, I mean, that example you give of Deb Aoki and that sort of thing, it's not like there was somebody doing that 20 years ago, there wasn't. And now we have all of the people who have, I mean, we're in the second and third generation of people who have been reading manga and learning how to read manga, and then learning how to speak Japanese and all of that. So I think that the information has changed, but I mean, in the past few months, I'll send out a thing that's just a catalog of a Fantagraphics catalog that has 5 to 10% of it is manga. And yet the responses I get are questions about like, hey, what can I do in this library for manga? It's like, people are hungry for this knowledge. They're hungry for this information, and they have people that can ask about it now, and they didn't before. They just didn't. And so, I mean, it's Deb Aoki can only be alive 24 hours a day, just like the rest of us. She has to sleep at times, so nowadays there's more people in, I'm sorry, but I see what you mean. But yeah, it's so much better now. So much better.
Hey, TJ, since this is really pretty native to you well, wait a second, both you and Mark have lived in this space. This has been your entire professional careers. Have you noticed from the day you walked through the door to now, the changes in the market? And if so, what really stands out for you?
Yeah, at least for me. So I'm like a little biased because, I'm a queer person working in the industry. I care a lot about advocating for queer authors, queer stories. And I feel like, especially in recent years, we're having almost a renaissance of queer manga, of BL manga, of Yuri manga. And just seeing the effects that it has on like young queer readers is, like, for example, like for me, like I think nothing will top like the height of my professional career is just kind of having the opportunity to have played a little part in bringing Boys Run the Riot by Keito Gaku over here. And that is, if you don't know about it, so Keito Gaku, he is a trans man, and Boys Run the Riot is a 4-volume series about a transgender high school student who starts a fashion brand with, his classmate who he becomes friends with. And they decide that, they want to make clothes, not just for queer people, but for anyone to be able to find clothes that they can be comfortable in and express their true selves in. And it's kind of had its own very like cult following, kind of going back to your previous question, that series does not have an anime and it's done really, really well. But it's led to, among, many other kind of smaller successes. We've done like a booth on it at San Diego Comic-Con. And Keito Gaku was actually invited as a guest last year to Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. And that was just such a phenomenal experience when he was giving his keynote to an audience of, there was just so many members in the audience who also identified as queer, who identified as trans, who like went up to him and were so clearly moved, by not only that story that he told through Boys Run the Riot, seeing themselves represented in their manga, but also so incredibly passionate about his craft and like what he does as an artist. And I don't know if I would have been able to experience something of that, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So just as a publishing professional and, just as a queer person advocating for queer stories, that was just, a very profound, moment that I got to experience.
Very cool. So Mark, same thing for you. From the day you walked in the door to now, those greatest changes, the things that have struck you the most.
Yeah, I have to think about that. I think one thing I'll say is that there's a wider variety of what does well. I you know, boys love and romance manga have always been a very important part of the industry, but what can be said now is, let's just take what TJ said. That was one of Kodansha's Boys Are in the Riot was one of Kodansha's best sellers for a stretch of time. Boys Love used to feel like this niche category. Everybody would have some, large because people who work in manga editorial often like Boys Love. So I think to a certain extent we're doing it for ourselves. But it's awesome to see that we are now at a time where these categories will have their heyday. They'll have their audience. From Yen Press, our best debut of this year is one that just came out late October, called The Guy She Was Interested In Wasn't the Guy at All, which falls under this category called Yuri manga. Yuri manga, which refers to girls love comics, has been a category that's been present for quite some time, but now we're seeing this category having mainstream successes. So I would say I had to pause because, to be honest with you, I don't know if there's a whole lot that's different. When I go to a Barnes and Noble shelf, I feel like it's as good as and as bad as it always was.
Right.
When I go to a Kinokuniya, I feel like they do a good job of stocking almost everything. When I go to select comic shops and indies, I feel like they do a good job of championing their darlings. I don't feel like that much has changed in general, but the people have changed, and the people have helped make categories which were once niche now more successful categories. And I look forward to seeing how much more has their heyday as time goes on.
I was following this from the earliest days when the library market really started to take shape, and you had these vanguard. Actually, they're still out there. These vanguard librarians who were shelving and championing the medium. Before then, the only thing you could hear was Kurt Hassler at Walden Books, and then it was librarians and the Great Graphic Novels for Teens Committee. And it's wonderful to see how well established manga collections have become in the public library space. But now there's a new wave going. There are books that globally are outselling manga series that are outselling Harry Potter. And it's fascinating when I bring this up in some meetings where people are not aware of that. And I'm curious as to everybody's take on why that is, why you see One Piece global, those kinds of things. Mike, you want to take first swing at that?
I don't know if I can answer that very well. I mean, I'm a manga editor, and my view is mostly related to just producing the books.
Right.
And what I know about sales and what I know about marketing is usually secondhand from other departments and other people.
So I'm guessing when they come in and ask you for more, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, it's good. It's good that, it's happening. It's maybe more work for me though.
Right.
But really, I want to punt that question to the more sales-oriented people on the panel here.
Who wants to take a shot at it?
Can you repeat the question?
The global, it's not just that the American market is really taking root, but globally, there are manga series that are really outpacing a lot of what Western readers are aware of. And I'm curious as to how that feels from your perspective, and where do you see that going?
It goes back to the first answer I gave here about what makes manga so compelling. I think manga are the greatest comics ever made. I think that specifically for when you look at the category of manga as a whole, right? And within that, like I said, there's the accessibility and the brilliance. Let's, as a practical example, let's use accessibility to describe something like a One Piece, like something coming out of Shonen Jump, something that if you have a classroom of middle school boys and girls, there's a good chance that 60% of them might like One Piece or something from Shonen Jump magazine. And brilliance, something like reading an Akira or an Appleseed or a Golgo 13 for the first time and being like, wow, I've never read anything like this. I didn't know that you could tell this kind of story. I didn't know you could feel this way about a character through comics. Japan's really killing it. So I go back to the answer that I gave. I think that's the reason why manga has captured the world's imagination to the level it has. I think that's the reason why it's reached the success that it has. when you look at our contributions, and by we, I'm talking about Americans through our comic industry, it's mostly through the Hollywood films, which I would say are brilliant and accessible too. If I'm being frank, I don't necessarily have that answer for the comics, especially not quite as much as the accessibility and brilliance of manga.
Tucker, what do you think?
I mean, I was going to pull the same card as Mark and say, take it back to all the compelling arguments. But I will say the thing that I'm always stuck with when I get into this stuff is the part of the reason that I love working in this field is because I get to be on the team that I want to be on, and that's team book, and that's team reading. And the thing about manga that I think that I that has always been my kind of my mantra with it from retail, from library work, from editorial, from all that is there are two teams. There's team reading, and then there's team we don't read. And manga is as much, it has shown itself to be one of the greatest and strongest entry points, in the same way that TJ is talking about, for so many people who have not, for whatever reason, made that jump. And it's amazing to see that happen. Will it last forever? I don't know. I mean, things change all the time. But right now, manga is doing the hero's work of bringing millions of people onto the team that I think is the best team you could ever be on, which is reading. I think it's an amazing experience. And it's because of all the reasons we talked about for compelling. It's because it makes it possible. There's no way to walk into the room if all the manga's in front of you and not find something that's going to speak to you. It's not possible. Unless you're somebody who doesn't want to read. And then, then it won't work for you.
All right, TJ, I'm going to go to you next on this one, and then everybody gets a shot at answering it. I'm going to tie it into a story of an experience I had where I was the one that brought up in the room, it's a manga project, and can we find other artists somewhere around the world to work on this project? And there was one guy who exploded and said, if they're not from Japan, it's not manga. I will quit if you do this. And I thought, that's like the beginning of rock and roll. Yeah, it had its birth in the, birthplace in the South, in the Bayou, and quickly spread worldwide and became a global phenomenon. So it's no longer simply an American thing. So aside from Japan, where do you see the next talent coming from as far as the creation of what we call manga, or what we recognize as manga? Does it have to be from Japan?
Yeah. So I would say that as of right now, Kodansha hasn't had the experience of publishing, an author, that isn't Japanese. But and I know that Mike will probably speak to this more. Like, Viz has a really amazing program where, American artists, artists who have the opportunities to submit to their portfolio reviews, can submit their one shots. And, it is very much not, exclusive to, Japanese authors anymore. Whereas I think also too, and this is a slightly different conversation, but, not only who is drawing manga, but who is manga being written for. I mentioned before that, we have several series that we're calling our Kodansha Reader Portal titles that they're being created by Japanese creators, but we're publishing them first on our website in English before the Japanese release. So now we're also kind of seeing manga artists approach manga differently, thinking oh, I'm gonna draw this for an American audience, or I'm gonna draw this for an international audience, and what stories are they interested in reading. But also too, there are several several of our series, for example, Beyond the Clouds, A Kingdom of Quartz. They actually are artists that are either French or Canadian. So you are seeing, manga artists that are not just Japanese, publish their work in Japan. And then it's coming back here when it gets translated and localized.
Mike, they threw it to you earlier.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Where's it coming from next? I suppose it probably could come from anywhere. I think there's a very strong feeling among fans of manga that manga is from Japan and only Japan. But that said, for a long time, there have been There's been a lot of content coming from Korea, manhwa, and even China. If you might be getting into the weeds here, because then you're talking about style,
Right.
art style, and I'm gonna even split hairs even more and say editorial style, maybe. TJ mentioned right now Viz has a program to try and cultivate not necessarily just only American, but non-Japanese manga artists. We've got an original program for that. And it is being spearheaded by the former chief editor of Shonen Jump magazine, who is Japanese. And my feeling about that is he's going to be bringing that Japanese editorial style to it. You know, I don't really know what his process is when he's looking at, you know, the submissions, or when he's giving these artists their editorial direction. But I'm sure that the Japanese manga style is coming from him and flowing to these new manga artists who are not Japanese. And will that create manga in the minds of the fans? You know, I think that attitude may also start to change as well as time goes on. Like 10, 15 years ago, I think a lot of fans would pretty adamantly say, well, if it's not from Japan, it's not manga.
Right.
But now, probably a lot of people are just going to look at the artwork and the style of it and go, oh, yeah, that's manga, and not really zero in on who made it.
Kind of like the musical analogy. It's rock and roll. It sounds like rock and roll to me. It doesn't matter where they're, you know, where they're from.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really, why that question came to me was I rewatched an interview with Kuliang. He was in South Africa for the launch of the Reed Pop Comic-Con that was there. And the attendance was overwhelming. The amount of manga influenced characters was incredible. You know, here in a place that is literally on the other side of the planet. So I was fascinated as to that moment, but also how soon you guys in editorial start to see some of those influences. I think we're getting it sounds like we're getting closer. Mark, do you guys see that at your shop?
Oh, I feel that influence has been around for a while at this point.
Right.
I mean, a show that Tucker and I went to is Small Press Expo. And when you go to a lot of these shows with the budding artists, it's very clear that there's a lot of them who have a strong manga influence. Pardon my cough. I actually would like to rephrase the question.
Sure.
That's being asked about where are we going to see manga come from. The reason why I want to rephrase it is because, as Mike sort of alluded to, this is a question that often becomes complicated because of the definition of what manga is. I'm less interested in answering that, and I'm more interested in talking about where are the greatest comics that are going to captivate the imagination and the love of readers around the world going to come from. And already there's a lot of them coming from Korea, I would say, outside of Japan, who's, you know, even 2 or 3 decades in as an international industry. The second fastest growing has been Korean comics. I think largely due to their accessibility. But something else that I want to call out when we ask the question of where are these great comics going to come from is how much are their creators being supported? I remember, let me give you an example. For New York Comic Con, I had helped put together a tour for trainees from Korea, these promising artists who were supposed to work in the industry. And then they visit America, they visit Japan, they check out the industries there to have a wider perspective of this career that they're trying to pursue, something funded by the government, the trip there, the visits there, everything. And I remember talking to one of our creators, Svetlana Shamakova, and I was, you know, she's Canadian. And I said to her, you know, it's really interesting. I feel like there was this crop of Canadian webcomic artists that went on to do cool things from your time. You, Faith Erin Hicks, Brian Lee O'Malley. Why is it that, you know, these Canadian webcomic artists became so big? Why specifically Canada? And she said it's for a sort of sad reason. It's because our government pays us health insurance. If I didn't get health insurance, I couldn't live as a full-time comic artist. And when I think about a lot of the talent that I would see at an SPX or at an alternative press expo, people whose comics I wanted to read, they end up working in animation. So I think it's very clear that we have this system in the United States where the promising talent who might have otherwise become these great comic artists who would have made things that the world would look at as great as manga, they end up working in animation instead because it's a viable career, as opposed to comics in the United States where that's less of the case. So to go back to the root of the question, where are we going to see this come from? We're going to see it come from the countries where there's the system in place, much like Japan, much like Korea, where if you're somebody doing colors for a Korean comic, that's a full-time position. There's internships for that. It isn't just something you do for the love of it for $200 for a cover or whatnot. Those countries that have a system to set up their artists for success is where we will see these great works down the line.
That's very cool. Anybody else want to take a shot at that?
I just want to add there, that's a great point that Mark made. Japan's manga publishing system, their magazines have been around for 70 years. And it's an established thing. And you can go into that and have a career in that. And
it's a respectable career too.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, being able to make a living at it, like a real living, is going to be crucial to it. And if the place where that person is from allows that, then that provides the soil for them to grow in.
True enough. All right. I've got one last question, then we're going to do the 30 seconds of shameless self-promotion. If I'm a librarian or a bookseller, which I am, what kind of resources do you have for us? Each one of you have some sort of support system that we can lean on for that kind of stuff? I'll go with Tucker to start.
Yeah, I mean, we have event kits. We do, ARCs. We go for trade reviews. We do the whole deal. I mean, whatever a book. I mean, if you want to carry Fantagraphics manga in your bookstore, I'm going to make it as easy as possible for you to do that. And if you want to have a stack of them in your library and you want to get them out there, I'm going to help you with do that too. You want to do them for a book club? We're going to figure that out. There's absolutely nothing that I can think of that I would not say yes to help a bookseller or a librarian get our manga into their various locations. It is impossible to hurt my feelings, and I have no shame.
That's perfect. Thank you. Mike, what about you?
I'm not a marketing guy, but I know Viz definitely supports a lot of libraries. And I know we reach out to a lot of them for a lot of our stuff. So yeah, just if you're a librarian, reach out to Viz Media, and I'm sure somebody will get a hold of you and set you up.
Very cool. Mark.
So we have a B2B newsletter. That's something that goes out once a month. It's curated by Morgana Santilli, who is our wonderful sales coordinator, somebody who was previously a retailer, worked at Comicopia in Boston, and also loves libraries. So the perfect person to communicate to both librarians and retailers. So we have that as our most reliable way to communicate with librarians and retailers. But additionally, we participate in streams and presentations like this, for everything Booklist and School Library Journal has that's relevant to our categories, whether they be graphic novels or middle grade or YA. We participate in all of them, and we love them. It's Morgana and another one of my employees who takes that on at this point, but we have so much fun with it. And the wish we have every time it happens is wish more people would come and watch these. So I hope for some of you watching here today, subscribe to our newsletter and check out our webinars.
Very cool. All right, TJ.
Yeah, so if you go to kodansha.us/librarians, we do have a librarian newsletter that you could sign up with. We also have downloadable marketing kits, as well as free digital samplers as well. I also highly encourage librarians to like reach out to us. We're always happy to send over any promotional things that we can. We also do several kind of similar to like what Mark mentioned. We love doing panels and events at libraries, whether it be in person or online. Those could be, centered around a certain theme. We've done events before where we're promoting certain kinds of titles. For example, we've done like a Pride event at NYPL focusing on our like BL, Yuri, and our LGBTQ plus titles. We've also done events. People are interested in working in this industry and they're like, hey, how is manga made? If I'm interested in getting involved in manga, what are my career opportunities like? We've also done panels and events like that at libraries as well. So definitely don't hesitate to go on our website and reach out to us. And we love working with librarians like that.
All right. And, I'm glad to hear the library mentioned everybody touched base on making sure libraries are mentioned, because in the earliest days, back actually when I first met Tucker, libraries, aside from B&N, and before that Walden Books, libraries were where you found this stuff, because the comic shops didn't really know what it was, and the indie booksellers seriously did not understand what the opportunity was. So thank you to everybody you work for investing in that part of the world for such a long time. It is sincerely appreciated. All right, so now the time is come for 30 seconds of shameless self-promotion. I want you to start with your name, your company, and then what's your next big thing. Tucker Stone first.
Hey, I already forgot the order of it. Tucker Stone, Fantagraphics. I would say my next big thing is we're doing Search and Destroy with Manga Splaining. Manga Splaining is an amazing podcast featuring Deb Aoki, Chris Butcher, David Brothers, Chip Zdarsky, and we teamed up with them already once, and we're doing a book, Search and Destroy. This is the first one; it's already out. The second one's on the way, and it's in celebration. I thought it's a good one to talk about because it's a reimagining of Osamu Tezuka's Dororo, taken cyberpunk style. So it harkens back to a young Tucker Stone's love of Appleseed. It's very, very violent, very, very fun, and it's great. Thank you.
Very cool. Thank you, Tucker. TJ.
Hey, so TJ Ferrantini, I'm with Kodansha, and I'm going to do a double suggestion. I'd be remiss without mentioning two of my favorite series right now that we're really, really promoting are Witch Hat Atelier and the Spellbook Library. Witch Hat Atelier is an amazing fantasy series set in a world where this girl wants to be a witch, but she's told, no, you can't be a witch. Witches are born, not made, until she learns that magic is created through art and by drawing, and that's how you can create magic and do magic spells and become a witch. And it is the most beautiful representation of, I've never read a manga that is set in a fantasy world, but is so steeped in our own world by way of, it has such a great diverse cast. It has a cast of like amazing disability representation. And that is also getting an anime next year. So we're really excited about that. And then our other title is The Spellbook Library, which is another magical fantasy set in a library about librarians who protect townsfolk by ferocious spell beasts. But the more you learn about the library, you start to wonder, are the spell beasts the monsters, or is it the librarians that are capturing them? So it's a really, really great fantasy manga. And I can't recommend those two titles enough.
All right. Thank you very much. Mark.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Mark from Yen Press. And the big hit coming from Yen Press is the guy she was interested in wasn't a guy at all. So the title says it all. This is a book about a girl who goes to a record store and is smitten with the handsome guy who's working there, this punkish dude who wears a mask. A lot of cool fashion. It's very Nana-like in this one, very punk. But little does our character know that this guy that she likes is actually a girl. So punk rock, awesome spot gloss color throughout the book, really awesome fashion, whether it's the punkish record store workers' outfits or the girl who likes her, who dresses in more conventionally attractive clothes. A very pretty book to look at. And I think for the next few years, when people say what their first Yuri manga was, they're going to say it was the guy she was interested in wasn't a guy at all. I have great feelings about this. I think it's building a genre. I think it's building a category. So everybody, give it a read.
All right, Mike, you get to bring it home.
All right. For me, it's I'm going to steal a little bit of TJ's thunder there and say two things. Both were recently announced. One is called Bugle Call: Song of War. It's a fantasy story set in a post-apocalyptic world where the characters have these strange powers and they get involved in this big epic war. My elevator pitch is it's sort of like X-Men meets Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. And it kind of crept up on me. It's pretty good. I like the world building in it. I think it's pretty exciting. It's got that gritty fantasy feel to it. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, you'll probably go for this. The other thing is Yaiba, which is a classic series from the creator of Case Closed, Gosho Aoyama. It was the first series that he did before he did Case Closed, and it's just a fun fantasy romp with some pretty crazy characters doing lots of crazy things. Very classic shonen stuff. And if you like Dragon Ball, you're probably going to like this too.
All right. Thank you, you guys. I really, really appreciate your time. And my name is John Shableski. I get to run the oldest indie bookstore in the country, which is one hell of a fun ride. And John Kraska from EveryLibrary, thank you, sir, for managing this cat herding event for us. Much appreciated. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.